It was a crisp autumn evening in Boston, just past 9:30 p.m., when Police Captain James Wilson finally headed home after pulling a double shift. The streetlights cast long shadows across his dark blue Toyota Camry as he drove through the quiet suburban streets of Brookline, an upscale neighborhood where he purchased a home 3 years ago after his promotion to captain. James had spent the day overseeing a complex drug bust operation and then stayed late to complete the mountain of paperwork that followed. His temples throbbed slightly from the endless cups of precinct coffee, and all he could think about was getting home to his wife Sarah and their two teenage children. He'd missed family dinner again, but Sarah always kept a plate warm for him in the oven on late nights like these. Dressed in civilian clothes, a gray sweater and black slacks, James looked like any other tired professional heading home after a long day. His badge and service weapon were secured in their proper places, as they had been for the past 20 years of his law enforcement career. The radio played softly in the background, jazz music helping him decompress from the day's tensions. As he turned onto Maple Street, just 2 blocks from his house, James noticed the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel as he checked his speedometer. 27 in a 30 zone. He hadn't rolled through any stop signs, his taillights were working. He checked them just yesterday, and his registration was up to date. 20 years of experience told him exactly what this was, but he took a deep breath and followed the procedure he'd taught countless young officers himself. James carefully pulled over to the right, positioning his car well out of the traffic lane. He turned off the jazz music, switched on his interior lights, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. Through his side mirror, James observed the patrol car door open. A young officer emerged, white, probably in his late 20s, and moving with the slightly stiff posture that suggested he was fairly new to the force. James could read anxiety in the officer's body language as he approached, one hand resting near his holster, a gesture that spoke volumes to someone with James's experience. The sound of shoes on asphalt grew closer, and James felt the familiar knot form in his stomach. He'd been in this situation more times than he cared to count, but this time was different. This wasn't just another traffic stop. This was happening in his own neighborhood, less than 2 blocks from where his children slept, where he'd worked so hard to provide them with a safe and comfortable life. James watched the officers approach in his side mirror, noting the name tag that read Reynolds. When the beam of the flashlight swept across his car, he could predict what would happen next. He'd seen it play out countless times from both sides of the badge. There would be that moment of surprise when Officer Reynolds saw him, that split second of recalibration that always occurred when expectations didn't match reality. The crickets chirped in the well-manicured lawns of Maple Street, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. James thought about his son Jason, who would be getting his driver's license next month. They'd already had the talk, not about birds and bees, but about what to do when, not if, but when, you got pulled over. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Yes, sir. No, sir. Don't argue. Make it home. As Officer Reynolds reached the driver's side window, James noticed a second officer hanging back by the patrol car. Standard procedure for nighttime stops. The flashlight beam swept across his face, and there it was, that slight change in the officer's expression, the momentary tightening around the eyes that James had seen so many times before. License and registration, Officer Reynolds said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that fresh academy graduates often use to mask their uncertainty. The beam of the flashlight lingered longer than necessary, scanning the car's interior, pausing on James's hands, still properly positioned on the steering wheel. In that moment, James made a decision. This wouldn't be just another traffic stop. After 20 years of wearing the badge, after rising through the ranks to become one of the highest-ranking black officers in the department, after serving and protecting the same streets where he was now being viewed with suspicion, this encounter would be different. Not because he was angry, though he had every right to be, but because he saw an opportunity. This young officer had no idea that his routine traffic stop was about to become a teaching moment that would change not only his career, but the entire department's approach to community policing. Officer Michael Reynolds felt his throat tighten as his flashlight beam illuminated the face of the driver. Something wasn't adding up. The man behind the wheel was black, middle-aged, and dressed too well for this to be the suspicious vehicle his instincts had flagged. Reynolds couldn't quite explain why he'd decided to make this stop. Something about an expensive car moving slowly through this neighborhood at night had triggered his suspicions. Back at the patrol car, his partner officer Sarah Chen watched the scene unfold. She had questioned the stop when Reynolds first hit the lights, asking what probable cause they had. Reynolds had mumbled something about suspicious behavior, but Chen knew better. In their 6 months patrolling together, she'd noticed a pattern in his traffic stops that made her increasingly uncomfortable. James Wilson studied the young officer's face in the harsh glare of the flashlight. 20 years on the force had taught him to read people, and right now, Reynolds was an open book. The slight tremor in his hand holding the flashlight, the too rigid posture, the way his other hand stayed close to his weapon, all signs of an officer who was nervous, and nervous cops could be dangerous cops. "Evening, officer," Wilson said calmly, his hand still visible on the steering wheel. He watched Reynolds' eyes dart around the car's interior, probably noting the empty coffee cup from the precinct, the dry-cleaned uniform hanging in the back seat, small details that didn't fit whatever scenario he constructed in his mind when he decided to make this stop. Chen shifted her weight uneasily by the patrol car, her hand resting on her radio. Something about this stop felt wrong from the start. The driver's body language was too composed, too familiar with procedure. This wasn't their usual traffic stop, and she could tell Reynolds was starting to realize it too. "License and registration," Reynolds repeated, his voice carrying less authority now. He'd been on the force for just 18 months, and something about this driver's calm demeanor was making him second-guess himself. The man's hands moved slowly, deliberately toward the glove compartment. Textbook procedure, exactly how they taught it at the academy. Wilson maintained steady eye contact with Reynolds as he reached for his documents. He recognized the look of uncertainty creeping into the young officer's eyes. It was the same look he'd seen countless times before, from both civilians and fellow officers who found themselves confronting their own preconceptions. The night air grew thicker with tension as Wilson's hand emerged from the glove compartment with his registration. His movements remained measured and calm as he reached for his wallet next. Reynolds' flashlight beam followed every motion, creating dancing shadows across the car's interior. Chen had moved a few steps closer, something about the situation drawing her in. From her angle, she could see both men's faces clearly, Reynolds, increasingly unsure of himself, and the driver, whose composure suggested he was very familiar with law enforcement procedures. As Wilson's wallet opened, Reynolds caught a glimpse of something metallic. His hand instinctively tightened on his flashlight, but before he could react further, the metallic object became clearly visible, a police badge. Not just any badge, but a captain's badge from their own department. The color drained from Reynolds' face as realization dawned. Chen, observing from her position, saw her partner's posture change instantly. Gone was the authoritative stance, replaced by something that looked very much like embarrassment. Wilson held his badge alongside his license, watching the transformation on Reynolds' face. The young officer's expression cycled through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, confusion, embarrassment, and finally, fear. Not fear of the black man in the car anymore, but fear of the consequences of having pulled over a superior officer without cause. "Captain Wilson," Reynolds managed to stammer, his flashlight beam finally dropping away from Wilson's face. I didn't." The silence that followed was deafening. Chen had moved close enough now to hear her partner's ragged breathing. She worked with Captain Wilson before, had attended several of his departmental briefings. His reputation for fairness was well known throughout the force, but so was his unwillingness to let teachable moments slip away. Wilson hadn't moved, his hand still holding his badge and license in plain view. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and professional, but carried an undertone that made both younger officers stand straighter. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "I think we need to have a conversation about what exactly made you decide to pull me over tonight." Officer Michael Reynolds stood frozen, his flashlight beam now pointed awkwardly at the ground as he stared at Captain Wilson's badge. The gold shield gleamed under the streetlights, a stark reminder of just how badly he had misread the situation. Behind him, Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably, already anticipating the conversation that would follow. "Sir, Reynolds started, then stopped. His mouth felt dry. The badge in Captain Wilson's hand wasn't just any captain's badge. It was from the same precinct where Reynolds had completed his training just 18 months ago. In fact, he now remembered seeing Wilson's photo on the wall of commanding officers, though they'd never directly interacted before. Captain Wilson carefully placed his badge and license on the dashboard, keeping his movements deliberate and measured. 20 years of experience had taught him that moments like these could either build bridges or burn them, depending on how they were handled. He watched as recognition slowly dawned on Reynolds' face, not just of who Wilson was, but of what this traffic stop really represented. "Officer Reynolds," Wilson said calmly, "do you remember the department training session from last month about community policing?" He kept his voice steady, neither angry nor accusatory. Through his side mirror, you could see Officer Chen moving closer, her face showing clear concern about how this situation might unfold. Reynolds nodded stiffly, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. He remembered the training clearly. Captain Wilson had been mentioned as one of its architects. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, having just racially profiled the very person who had helped design their anti-bias training programs. "Yes, sir," Reynolds managed to say. You were one of the program developers." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he felt a bead of sweat roll down his back despite the cool evening air. The weight of his mistake was becoming increasingly apparent with each passing second. Officer Chen had now positioned herself where she could better observe both men. She worked under Captain Wilson during her rookie year and had always admired his approach to difficult situations. Even now, she could see him controlling the narrative, turning what could have been an explosive confrontation into something else entirely. "That's right," Wilson replied, still maintaining his composed demeanor. "And do you remember what we discussed about decision points in traffic stops?" He gestured slightly toward the patrol car's dashcam, which was recording everything. "About what prompts an officer to decide a vehicle is suspicious." Reynolds felt his face grow hot. The dashcam footage would show exactly what had happened. Him spotting a black man driving an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood and immediately assuming something was wrong. There was no traffic violation, no probable cause, nothing except his own biased assumptions. "I should have had probable cause," Reynolds admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission hung heavy in the night air. Behind him, Chen nodded slightly, appreciating her partner's honesty even in this uncomfortable moment. Captain Wilson leaned forward slightly in his seat, his hands still visible on the steering wheel. "Officer Reynolds, I live 2 blocks from here. This is my neighborhood. My children attend the local schools. I serve on the community board." He paused, letting each statement sink in. "What made this vehicle suspicious to you?" The question wasn't really a question. It was an invitation to confront an uncomfortable truth. Reynolds stood there, agency flashlight pointed at the ground, trying to find words that wouldn't come. How could he explain a decision that, he now realized, had been based entirely on unconscious bias? Officer Chen watched as her partner struggled with the revelation. She tried to warn him about his pattern of stops, but sometimes lessons had to be learned the hard way. This was turning into exactly the kind of teaching moment that Captain Wilson was known for throughout the department. "Sir, I apologize," Reynolds finally said, his voice steadier now. "I made assumptions that were wrong and unprofessional." He straightened his posture, facing the consequence of his actions. "I'm prepared to accept any disciplinary action you deem appropriate." Captain Wilson studied the young officer's face for a moment. He saw something there, not just embarrassment or fear of punishment, but the beginning of understanding. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons came from the most uncomfortable moments. "Disciplinary action isn't what's needed here, Officer Reynolds," Wilson said, reaching for his door handle. "What's needed is a conversation, and I think right now is the perfect time to have it." Captain Wilson stepped out of his car with the same careful movements he'd been teaching young officers for years. Officer Reynolds took a step back, still struggling to process how his routine traffic stop had transformed into this moment. Officer Chen remained nearby, her presence adding another layer of witness to what was unfolding. "Let's take a walk," Wilson suggested, gesturing toward a nearby park bench beneath a streetlight. The residential street was quiet now, with only the occasional light visible in surrounding windows. This conversation, Wilson decided, needed to happen right here, right now, while the moment was fresh and its impact could be most meaningful. Reynolds glanced uncertainly at his partner, but Chen nodded encouragingly. She'd already switched their radio status to indicate they were conducting a field interview, buying them the time needed for this impromptu meeting. The three officers made their way to the bench, their shadows stretching long across the neatly trimmed grass. "Tell me about your shift tonight," Wilson began, sitting down on the bench. His tone was conversational, almost casual, but his eyes remained focused intently on Reynolds' face. The young officer remained standing, shifting his weight from one foot to another, his discomfort visible in every movement. "It's been quiet, sir," Reynolds responded, his hand unconsciously touching his badge. "A few traffic violations, one domestic disturbance call, but nothing major." He paused, then added, Until now." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "And what made you notice my vehicle?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Chen, standing slightly apart, watched her partner's face as he struggled to articulate an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. "I observed." Reynolds started, then stopped. The standard phrases he'd used in countless police reports suddenly felt hollow. "Sir, I honestly don't know. Something just seemed off." Even as he said it, he realized how it sounded. Off. Wilson repeated the word, letting it settle between them. "I was driving under the speed limit. My car is well maintained. My registration and lights are current." What exactly was off about the situation, Officer Reynolds? Reynolds felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. The truth was becoming unavoidable. "Sir, I saw a black man driving an expensive car in this neighborhood, and I made assumptions I shouldn't have made." Wilson leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do you know what I was thinking when I saw your lights in my mirror?" He didn't wait for a response. "I was thinking about my son. He's getting his license next month, and I've been dreading having the talk with him." "The talk, sir?" Reynolds asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Not about birds and bees," Wilson explained, his voice remaining steady, "about how to survive a traffic stop. About keeping his hands visible, moving slowly, saying yes, sir, and no, sir. About swallowing his pride if he needs to, because making it home alive is more important than being right." Jen shifted her position, the weight of Wilson's words affecting her deeply. She'd heard similar stories during diversity training, but hearing it from a superior officer, in this context, made it painfully real. "Every time I put on the uniform," Wilson continued, "I carry two realities with me. I'm a police captain who served this city for 20 years, but I'm also a black man who still gets pulled over in his own neighborhood. Both of these truths exist simultaneously, Officer Reynolds." Reynolds finally sat down on the bench, the gravity of the situation forcing him to see it from a new perspective. "I never thought," he began, then corrected himself. "No, that's not true. I didn't want to think about it, about how my actions might affect people." Wilson nodded, recognizing the moment of honest self-reflection. "That's where we start," he said. "Not with denial or defensiveness, but with acknowledgement. What happened tonight isn't just about one traffic stop. It's about patterns and assumptions that we, as law enforcement officers, have the power and responsibility to change." The three officers sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling around them. A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across them, and Wilson couldn't help but notice how Reynolds tensed slightly at its approach. A small but telling reaction that showed perhaps he was beginning to understand how it felt to be unnecessarily scrutinized. "So," Wilson said finally, "let's talk about what happens next." The park bench beneath the streetlight had become an unlikely classroom for an important lesson in policing. Captain Wilson watched as Officer Reynolds struggled to find words to explain his actions, while Officer Chen stood nearby, bearing silent witness to this crucial moment in her partner's career. "Walk me through your thought process," Wilson said, his voice remaining professional and measured. "From the moment you first spotted my vehicle until you turned on your lights. What were you thinking at each step?" Reynolds took a deep breath, knowing that complete honesty was his only option. His palms were sweaty despite the cool night air, and he wiped them nervously on his uniform pants. "I saw your car first on Oak Street," he began. "It was moving slowly, about 10 under the speed limit." "And that's suspicious behavior," Wilson prompted, knowing where this was leading. "No, sir," Reynolds admitted. "Lots of people drive cautiously at night. I didn't actually make the decision to follow until. He paused, the realization of his own bias becoming clearer with each word. Until? Wilson encouraged, though he already knew the answer. Until I saw you through the rear window at the stop sign. I saw. Reynolds' voice trailed off, the shame of his admission catching in his throat. You saw a black man. Wilson completed the sentence for him. In an expensive car. In this neighborhood. Each phrase landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of understanding. Chen shifted her weight uncomfortably, remembering similar stops they'd made over the past 6 months. How many of those have been based on the same unspoken assumptions? Sir, Reynolds said, his voice slightly stronger now, I was trained to look for things that don't fit the pattern, to trust my instincts about suspicious behavior. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. And what made this situation not fit the pattern? Was it the well-maintained car, the careful driving, or was it simply that you didn't expect someone who looks like me to live in this neighborhood? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Reynolds felt the full weight of his biased reasoning crash down upon him. His police academy training about probable cause and reasonable suspicion suddenly seemed to clash with the unconscious prejudices he never fully acknowledged. The truth is, Wilson continued, his tone remaining educational rather than accusatory, I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years. I'm on the community board. My children attend the local schools. Yet I still get followed by patrol cars. Still get suspicious looks from my own neighbors. Still have to prove I belong here. Reynolds listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time understanding how his actions contributed to a larger pattern. But sir, we're taught to be proactive, to prevent crime before it happens. And how do we decide what crime looks like? Wilson asked, leaning forward slightly. What makes someone look suspicious? Is it their behavior, or is it something else? He gestured to his civilian clothes, the gray sweater and black slacks. If I were wearing my uniform right now, would you have followed my car? The question struck Reynolds like a physical blow. He knew the answer immediately. Of course, he wouldn't have followed a clearly marked police vehicle or an officer in uniform. The realization made his earlier justifications feel hollow. Chen, who had remained silent throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke up. I've noticed patterns in our stops, she admitted quietly. I should have said something sooner. Wilson turned his attention to her. It's not easy to challenge a partner's decisions in the moment, but part of our job is holding each other accountable. We can't change what we don't acknowledge. Reynolds sat straighter on the bench, facing the uncomfortable truth head-on. I made assumptions based on race, he said firmly, finally putting it into words. I violated department policy and constitutional rights based on nothing more than prejudice. That's right, Wilson agreed, his tone softening slightly at Reynolds' honesty. But acknowledging it is just the first step. The real question is, what are you going to do differently tomorrow, and the day after that? The 3 officers sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the sound of crickets and distant traffic filling the night air. This conversation was just the beginning, Wilson knew. Real change would require more than just one moment of revelation. It would demand ongoing commitment to examining and challenging their own assumptions. I want to do better, Reynolds finally said, his voice firm with newfound conviction. I need to do better. Wilson nodded, seeing the genuine desire for change in the young officer's eyes. Then let's talk about how we make that happen. The next morning, Officer Michael Reynolds sat nervously in the precinct's small coffee shop, his uniform pressed extra crisp, arriving 15 minutes earlier than the time Captain Wilson had suggested. He'd barely slept last night, replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. The paper cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him, growing colder with each passing minute. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Captain Wilson walked in, dressed in his full uniform with 4 gold stars gleaming on his collar. Several officers in the coffee shop straightened in their seats, offering respectful nods to their superior. Wilson grabbed a coffee and made his way to Reynolds' table, his presence commanding attention without seeking it. Good morning, Officer Reynolds, Wilson said, pulling out a chair. His voice was friendly but professional, carrying none of the tension from the previous night's encounter. I appreciate you being here early. Reynolds sat up straighter, trying to find the right words. Sir, about last night, he began, but Wilson held up a hand to pause him. Before we discuss that, I want to tell you a story, Wilson said, taking a sip of his coffee. It was my third year on the force. I pulled over a car for a broken taillight, and the driver was a young black teenager. He was terrified, shaking. Turned out he was the son of a city council member, just driving home from basketball practice. Reynolds listened intently, noticing how other officers in the coffee shop were trying not to obviously eavesdrop on their conversation. Wilson continued, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear. That stop changed me, Wilson explained, leaning forward slightly. Not because of who the kid's father was, but because I saw myself in that boy's eyes. I remembered being that scared teenager, pulled over for no real reason. Even with a badge on my chest, I was still living both sides of that experience. The coffee shop had grown quieter, the usual morning chatter dying down as more officers tuned in to their captain's words. Reynolds noticed Officer Chen enter, catching her supportive nod as she got in line for coffee. "Sir," Reynolds said, finding his voice, "I've been thinking all night about what you said, about patterns and assumptions. I pulled my stop records for the last 6 months." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Wilson raised an eyebrow, taking the offered document. It showed a clear pattern. Of all the suspicious vehicle stops Reynolds had made, over 70% involved minority drivers. The numbers told a story that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. "This is good," Wilson said, sliding the paper back across the table. "Not the numbers themselves, but the fact that you took the initiative to look for them. That's where real change begins, with self-awareness." Reynolds nodded, then asked the question that had kept him awake most of the night. "How do you balance being vigilant with being fair? How do you know when your instincts are about actual suspicious behavior versus bias?" Wilson smiled slightly. It was the right question to ask. By now, Chen had joined them, pulling up a chair as Wilson began explaining the practical strategies he'd developed over his 20 years of service. "It starts with questions," Wilson said. "Before you hit those lights, ask yourself, what specific behaviors am I seeing? Would I find these same behaviors suspicious if the driver looked different? Can I articulate a real reason for this stop that doesn't involve race or assumptions?" For the next hour, the 3 officers talked openly about their experiences, challenges, and lessons learned. Other officers drifted in and out of the conversation, some sharing their own stories, others just listening and reflecting. "The hardest part," Wilson explained, addressing the small group that had gathered, "is admitting that we all have biases, every single one of us. The question is, do we let those biases control our actions, or do we control them?" Reynolds looked around at his fellow officers, seeing nods of understanding and recognition. Last night's embarrassing traffic stop was transforming into something bigger, a moment of change not just for him, but potentially for the entire department. As their coffee cups emptied and the morning shift beckoned, Wilson stood up. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice carrying authority and warmth, "I think you're ready to be part of the solution. How would you feel about helping me with next month's bias awareness training?" Reynolds straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of both the responsibility and the opportunity. "I'd be honored, sir," he replied, knowing that his mistake could become a powerful teaching tool for others. Wilson nodded approvingly. "Then let's get to work." News of the traffic stop incident and the subsequent coffee shop conversation spread through the Boston Police Department like wildfire. Within a week, what started as a potentially explosive situation had transformed into something unexpected, a catalyst for genuine change. Captain Wilson's office had never been busier. Officers from different precincts began stopping by, some sharing their own experiences, others seeking advice. The small incident on Maple Street had opened a door that many didn't even realize was closed. Officer Reynolds found himself in an unusual position. His fellow officers' reactions varied. Some avoided eye contact in the hallways, while others approached him privately to discuss their own moments of realization about bias in their work. His partner, Officer Chen, stood firmly by his side, helping him navigate this new territory. "You know what's different about this?" Chen said one afternoon as they patrolled their usual route. "It's not just another mandatory sensitivity training. This is real. This is one of our own being honest about making a mistake and wanting to do better." The department's weekly briefings took on a new tone. Captain Wilson and Reynolds began incorporating short discussions about traffic stops and decision-making processes. They didn't preach or condemn. Instead, they asked questions that made officers think. What made you suspicious? Would you have reacted the same way if? What specific behaviors caught your attention? During one particularly memorable briefing, Reynolds stood before his colleagues, his voice steady despite his nerves. 3 weeks ago, I made a traffic stop based on nothing but bias, he began. I almost ruined my career, but instead, I learned the most important lesson of my life. The room fell silent as Reynolds shared his story. He talked about the shame he felt when he realized his mistake, the fear of consequences, and most importantly, the enlightenment that followed. His honesty struck a chord with many officers who had made similar judgment calls but never confronted their own biases. Captain Wilson watched from the back of the room as Reynolds spoke. He saw heads nodding, saw officers exchanging glances, saw the moment's impact rippling through the ranks. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about changing the culture of policing from within. The changes began to show in the statistics. Over the next few months, the number of traffic stops based on suspicious behavior decreased significantly, while the number of actual arrests from legitimate stops increased. Officers were making better, more conscious decisions about when and why to pull someone over. Community leaders noticed the difference too. At a town hall meeting, an elderly black resident stood up and said, "Something's different. The officers in our neighborhood, they're looking at us differently now. They're seeing people, not suspects." The local police academy requested Captain Wilson and Officer Reynolds to develop a new training module. They called it the Maple Street Incident, a case study in confronting and overcoming bias in law enforcement. Reynolds' stop records became a teaching tool, showing how unconscious prejudices could influence an officer's decisions without them even realizing it. Officer Chen developed her own role in the program, teaching other officers how to speak up when they notice concerning patterns in their partner's behavior. "It's not about calling someone racist," she would explain. "It's about helping each other be better officers, better protectors of our community." The ripple effect reached beyond their department. Other police forces in neighboring cities began requesting information about the program. Local news stations ran stories about the positive changes happening within the Boston Police Department. What could have been a scandal became a model for positive transformation. One evening, as Reynolds and Chen finished their shift, they spotted Captain Wilson in the parking lot. The three of them had developed a unique bond through this experience. Wilson waved them over. "Just got a call from the commissioner," Wilson said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Our department's traffic stop complaints are down 40% since we started the new awareness programs. Real change is happening." Reynolds nodded, thinking about how different things could have been if Wilson had chosen punishment over education that night. "Sir," he said, "do you ever think about what would have happened if I pulled over someone else that night? Someone who wasn't a police captain?" Wilson's expression grew serious. "I think about it every day," he replied. "That's why we're doing this work. Because the next person might not have a badge to protect them. Our job is to make sure they don't need one." As they stood in the parking lot, watching the sun set over the city they had sworn to protect and serve, all three officers knew that the ripple effect of that one traffic stop would continue to spread, changing their department and their community, one conscious decision at a time. 6 months after the night of the traffic stop on Maple Street, the Boston Police Department had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The incident that could have ended Officer Michael Reynolds' career instead sparked a revolution in police training across the state of Massachusetts. On a bright morning in the police academy's main lecture hall, Captain Wilson stood before a new class of recruits, with Officer Reynolds and Officer Chen by his side. The room was packed, not just with cadets, but with senior officers, community leaders, and even representatives from neighboring state police departments. "The badge we wear," Wilson began, his voice carrying through the hushed room, "is not just a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of responsibility. 6 months ago, an incident happened that taught us exactly what that means." Reynolds stepped forward, no longer the nervous officer who had made a biased traffic stop. His posture showed confidence born not from authority, but from understanding. "I was that officer," he said to the crowd, "the one who made the stop based on nothing but bias. But instead of ending my career, that mistake taught me the most valuable lesson in policing." The presentation screen behind them showed statistics from their department's new training program. Traffic stop complaints had dropped by 40%. Community trust ratings had increased significantly. But more importantly, successful arrests from legitimate stops had improved, showing that better judgment led to more effective policing. In the audience, Officer Chen noticed several of their regular patrol officers nodding along. These weren't just numbers on a screen to them. They had lived this transformation. They had seen how questioning their own assumptions led to better decision-making on the streets. During the break, a young cadet approached Reynolds. "Sir," she said, her voice hesitant, "how do you know when you're making decisions based on real suspicion versus other factors?" Reynolds smiled, remembering asking Captain Wilson the same question months ago. "Watch this," he said, pulling up dash cam footage from a recent traffic stop. The video showed him following the car, but instead of immediately hitting the lights, his voice could be heard on the recording, asking himself the questions that have become standard procedure. What specific behaviors am I seeing? Would I find these same behaviors suspicious if the driver looked different? Can I articulate a real reason for this stop? The cadet's eyes widened with understanding. This wasn't just theory. This was practical, applicable wisdom that could shape her entire career. Later that afternoon, Captain Wilson sat in his office, reviewing letters from other police departments requesting information about their training program. On his desk sat a framed photo from last week's community outreach event. Officers and citizens together, barriers breaking down, trust building up. A knock on his door revealed Reynolds and Chen. "Sir," Reynolds said, "the state police commissioner called. They want to implement our training program across all departments in Massachusetts." Wilson leaned back in his chair, thinking about how far they'd come. "You know," he said, "that night on Maple Street, I had two choices. I could have filed a complaint, ended a career, and nothing would have changed. Or we could do what we did, turn a mistake into a movement." Chen smiled. "And now it's becoming state policy," she added. "The Maple Street incident will be taught in every police academy in Massachusetts." Reynolds looked at the commendation letter on Wilson's desk, recognition from the governor for their innovative approach to police reform. "It's strange," he said quietly. "That night, I thought I was finished. Instead, I found my true purpose as an officer." Wilson stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the street where officers and citizens went about their daily lives. "This is what real change looks like," he said. "Not forced by regulations or fear of punishment, but grown from understanding and a genuine desire to do better." As the sun began to set over Boston, casting long shadows across the precinct parking lot, the three officers stood together, knowing their work was far from over. But they had proved something vital, that positive change was possible, that one moment of honesty could transform an entire system, and that the best kind of authority came not from a badge, but from the wisdom to wear it properly. Outside, a new shift of officers began their patrol, each one carrying not just their badge and gun, but also the lessons learned from a traffic stop that never made headlines but changed everything. They carried with them the understanding that true justice begins not with power, but with perspective, and that the greatest authority comes from the courage to admit when we're wrong and the wisdom to learn from it.